Hey everyone, Warrax here. With BfA ending and everyone's eyes looking towards Shadowlands, I wanted to take a step back and look at the journey that each class had in BfA. Today, we're going to be looking at Priests. I know, I said Warlocks at the end of the last video. Sorry to those looking for that video. My excuse is that I've been pushing levels on my Monk, which took time away from me being able to get low-level Warlock dungeon footage. Monk has become a prime choice as my main in Shadowlands. I'll probably do a video on my main for Shadowlands once I get to play the 3 characters that are in contention in the pre-patch. But enough of that, let's get into Priests. If this is your first retrospective video, first off, welcome. I encourage you to check out the other ones that we've done so far as well. I look at each spec in both Mythic Plus and Raid, grade each individually, and then average the grade to get the spec an overall grade for PvE this expansion. This looks at mainly performance, community perception, and representation of the spec in both Mythic Plus and Raid. Before we angelic feather into the pre-specs, I just wanted to give a shout out to my guild member and fellow officer, barely above average on Icecrown NA, Nual. He has stepped up and helped me record footage, so you get high-level gameplay on his priests, rather than my level 30 priest. We're going to start with the DPS spec, Shadow. Shadow priests were an interesting place at the start of BfA. By many, they were considered dead on expansion, as they didn't get their full class changes before BfA actually released. As a result, they spent the first patch of the expansion in a tough spot. While not as bad as, say, Elemental Shamans or Marksmanship Hunters, the community was quick to stomp over the bodies of Shadow. They have a historical precedent of that happening. The biggest struggle was how to make Void Form work with no artifact weapon and the lower overall stats of BfA. In Mythic Plus, this meant that Shadow had some ramp-up time. To quote Nual, quote, "The first Void Form is okay, but getting into the second, third, and fourth ones are pretty powerful," end quote. This meant that Shadow needed chain pulling with little to no breaks in between to be successful. This is easily done in organized groups where your healer, tank, and Shadow Priest could all communicate. In pickup groups, this was obviously much harder as you don't know how comfortable the tank is with chain pulling or how effective the healer can be managing their mana. Once 8.1 hit and the second Azerite trait for spec-specific traits was allowed, and borrowed power began to scale big time as well, Shadow became a lot better. The utility was pretty niche, but in places where Mass Dispel and Mind Control could be useful, they were very powerful. There just wasn't a lot of places where you could make it work that well. Overall, Shadow in Mythic Plus was better than I think many people thought. It just required playing around the Priest, which was difficult to do when you could just pick other specs that you didn't have to do anything special for, and they would just perform as well, if not better than the Priest did. Grade is a C. And Raid, once 8.1 hit, they were staples of raid teams for the rest of the expansion. Part of that was their ability to use multiple spec-specific Azerite traits, which were vital to the spec's viability. The other part was that the general fight design began to favor them. A lot of fights were either spread cleave, had ad phases that actually lasted a little bit of time, or they were just long fights in general. See you, Jaina, at nearly, 9 or 10 minutes? All of these favored priests, as it allowed their dots and void forms to ramp up and be maintained in a much easier fashion. Even with 8.0 being below average for them, I think the grade for raiding priests is pretty high. They were just that good in the last 3 quarters of the expansion. The grade is an A. If I had to rate them like 1 to 10 or 1 to 11 for range specs, Shadow Priest would probably be just below Fire Mage, but right in the mix with Warlock specs, and probably ahead of Moonkin as well. The overall grade for Shadow is a B. Shadow was looking horrendous going into Shadowlands. However, the recent overhaul has many players being much more optimistic about the spec. Void Form just ultimately didn't work outside of the systems of Legion, so it's become a cooldown instead. This is better, probably, for the better of the spec's health long term. We'll have to see. I think it's going to work definitely for Shadowlands, but we'll have to see how it maybe functions out more beyond in patch 10 and patch 11. Nual in particular is extremely excited to get his hands on it, already liking what he's experienced in the pre-patch PTR already. Now we'll move on to the healing specs, and we'll start with Discipline. Discipline Priest is the spec that everyone thinks of when the term passive healer damage is thrown around. A spec that does damage to help amplify its healing, Disc is hailed by many healer mains as the most fun to play healer in WoW. Some have even said it's the best healer spec in any MMO on the market right now. That's high praise. Let's look at how it performed. In Mythic Plus, they spent the first patch on par with Resto Druid in terms of power level, as the top healers. Sadly, this wasn't a sign of things to come. Disc was frankly overtuned in the first patch. Once the proper tweaks were made, and the atonement healing in particular, Disc fell behind the top level healers of Mythic Plus. Disc's style of healing doesn't fit perfectly inside Mythic Plus, although it can be successful. The damage to do healing style is good for boss fights, but it could be problematic on certain trash pools. Atonement is such a core part of the spec that the only direct heal Disc has is Shadow Mend. This makes reactive gameplay a little bit more difficult unless you're aggressive with your power word shield and atonements. The utility is ultimately what did it in as a high key pusher or a staple in the MDI. While it has good defensive utility with pain suppression, power word barrier, rapture, it didn't have any sort of crowd control style ability with like Ursol's Vortex or Ring of Peace that could be useful for mob control. After Atonement was tuned down in 8.1, Disc felt just kind of middle of the road and was harder to manage on weeks like Bursting or Grievous, since enemies being around is when Disc maximizes his healing, and a lot of Bursting and Grievous is handled post-fight. Grade is a C. In Raid, they were the #1 healer for pretty much the entire expansion. Their shields, Atonement, Power Word Barrier, Schism were among the many tools that Disc had shining brightly this expansion. They did passive damage, which is damage without sacrificing their healing throughput, and that helped with fights that had tight enraging timers. Their damage reduction abilities were huge assets to raid teams, where you could reduce the damage on anywhere between 10 to 30 players and save a lot of mana on your healing team. Spamming out shields on multiple raid members made their raid healing very effective, and they could also tank heal pretty effectively as well. They just kind of did it all. Disc Priest started out the ironclad wall of healer that kind of blocked everyone else from getting through. Holy Paladins and Resto Shaman hit them in 8.1, and then they pushed out Resto Shamans for 8.2 and 8.3, which made the 2 Disc, 2 Holy Paladin meta comps for the last 2 raid tiers pretty strong. And it doesn't look like anything's changing for early Shadowlands based on what you're hearing those level of guys talk about. Grade, S tier. Overall grade is an A. The raid grade is a little bit more of a heavy hitter here. Disc was such a dominating force in raid that it carries this grade pretty hard. It doesn't look like much is changing with the healing dynamic for World First leveling guilds going into Shadowlands, and the spec looks like it's maintained a lot of good things with some very interesting legendaries and conduits being playing out for it. Though it does seem that the Covenant abilities are generally not that great for Priest overall. And finally, Holy Priest. Holy Priest is the classic healer. Their gameplay loop was anything but, however. I enjoyed the heck out of the spec this expansion, and they were the #1 healer for me. This doesn't mean they performed well though. In Mythic Plus, they struggled. They were probably one of the worst healers for Mythic Plus, even below Shamans. Their healing output is extremely reactive and requires a lot of hard cast abilities to reduce the cooldowns on your instant cast abilities. Guardian Spirit isn't a true tank cooldown that allows you to ultimately save the tank or save your party. Overall, the utility wasn't great. They lacked the mob control that Disc Priest does. Their mobility was very limited, with only Angelic Feather being useful, and defensive abilities on themselves didn't really exist unless you used Guardian Spirit. They didn't have a barrier that they could get everyone to stand in and help them catch up. Grade D. In Raid, they were much more serviceable. They had a high throughput. The biggest thing that held them down is that they had to sacrifice healing to do damage, unlike their disciplined compatriots. They did not have any tool that acted as a pseudo damage reduction. Holy Word Salvation was just a massive healing output. And damage reduction became very important for healing teams as the expansion carried on. If you take out mythic rating logs, Holy Priest was actually one of the strongest healers. Normal and heroic rating really prioritizes healing throughput rather than the utility side. Once you added mythic rating, where utility becomes almost as important as your throughput, they were bottom of the barrel. This puts them in an interesting position. Their ability to put out massive healing numbers was almost unmatched at low to mid levels of rating. At the highest point though, they just weren't up to snuff. Grade here is going to be a B+. Overall grade is going to be a C+. Holy Priest has gotten some tools in Shadowlands that are generating a lot of interest among the Priest community. More damage tools are going to allow for higher damage output when they choose to sacrifice that healing, which is I think one of the things the spec needed. The other thing they need is more mobility and maybe a utility piece and a better cooldown, but none of that has been addressed so far. Overall, Priests are getting an interesting set of tools across the board. Shadow has gotten a well-received overhaul, and most folks seem excited about the changes coming for Disc and Holy. Nual is back to pushing his Priest as his main for Shadowlands. I'll be curious how each spec plays out over the next 2 years. While it's not a class I will play in depth, I'm definitely going to be interested to see the dichotomy between Holy and Disc representation, and how Shadow slots in with Warlocks, Mages, Moonkins, and others in the ranged DPS caster role. So how did you rate Priests this expansion? Leave a comment below and remember to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. It'd mean a lot to me. As a reminder, our guild, barely above average on Icecrown NA, the Alliance side, is recruiting. If you want to get an idea of what we're like, check out any of the most recent Mythic Dungeon runs that have been posted, with more coming soon. This will give you a good idea of kind of what we are as players and our general vibe that we like to try and push through. Next up, we're going to do Warlocks, for real this time. Until then everyone, stay safe, wear your mask, and I will see you next time.